We have with us today my colleague and dear friend, Peggy Nagae, who I reached out to after listening to the Supreme Court oral arguments on whether or not to overturn affirmative action. Peggy, in addition to being a colleague that together we ran an organization for, in addition to all of that, and all of her background as an experienced DEI consultant, practitioner, coach, strategist, amazing person. She's also a lawyer. And the thing that got me interested in trying to talk to Peggy was this idea of race neutrality, which gets referred to over and over again. And in fact, we'll talk more about this, but in the oral arguments about affirmative action, the term diversity was used over 200 times. So DEI, Peggy, I think, is kind of on the block here, as well as whether or not they're going to overturn affirmative action. So I wanted Peggy to join us today to talk more about it from the perspective of not only being a DEI practitioner, but also a recovering, as you say sometimes, Peggy, a recovering attorney. So let me just say a couple of things about Peggy so that you all understand a little bit more of her background. She's the founder of Peggy Nagae Consulting. She's got an AB from Vassar in Eastern Asian Studies, a Juris Doctor, a JD, with honors from the Northwestern School of Law at Lewis and Clark College, an MA in Spiritual Psychology from the University of Santa Monica. We're halfway through. A Bachelor in Illumination Sciences from the Jualan, how do you say that? Mutika School for Illumination. She also holds certificates from the Institute of Educational Management at Harvard, the Covey Leadership Institute, and several dispute resolution centers. Peggy is an enormously talented person who has dedicated her life to finding justice for people and continuing to look for ways to do that in ways that harmonize with each person's mind and heart and spirit. And Peggy, I'm just so grateful for you taking the time today to talk about affirmative action and the court and hopefully a couple of other things as well. So thank you.
You're welcome, Jim. My pleasure. I miss working with you.
Oh, yeah, so good to be working with you. What I leave, in addition, I really shortened the whole thing, which is amazing about all the things that you've done. What else would you say you'd want the audience to know about your background? Is there anything that kind of, I just kind of went through the list. Mm-hmm. But what matters to you about that?
A couple things. One, I was the lead attorney on the Yasui versus United States case, in which we reopened his World War II conviction, a violation of the curfew, after we found documents in the National Archives that said that the incarceration of Japanese Americans was not based on military necessity, as the U.S. Supreme Court ruled, but based on racial discrimination. And that the other documents we found were that the government attorneys withheld this critical evidence from the U.S. Supreme Court. They had evidence that showed that it was based on race and not based on military necessity, and they did not present it to the court. That's one thing. The second thing is being the sort of on-the-ground strategist and leading the way for Yasui to receive a Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama in 2015. And the third thing,
the only Oregonian, is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
To receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Wow.
Yes. Yeah. And the third one is my association work with Dean Derek Bell, who was dean at the University of Oregon Law School, and he hired me as his assistant dean. But he was he's the godfather of critical race theory. He's the first Black tenured professor at Harvard Law School, the first Black law dean of a mainly white public institution in the history of legal education. And he was quite something.
Yeah. And co-author of the critical race, the original paper about critical race theory. He was as you said, the father of that kind of movement and helping us understand it. And you clerked for him.
No, I was the assistant dean at the University of Oregon Law School when he was the dean.
Okay.
But he worked with Thurgood Marshall before Thurgood Marshall went on the Supreme Court, and they brought desegregation cases, which influenced those cases and the movement that they didn't get influenced his views on the permanency of race and racism in U.S. culture.
Right. Wow. Yeah. So all of that while you doing the Yasui case and working on that and the Medal for Freedom, all of that while you were also managing your practice and in working in the world and doing what you do for, that was just an extra little thing you threw in on top of everything else you were already doing.
Right.
But the Yasui case is significant in a number of ways. For me, at least, getting to know you and understanding it. To begin with, I grew up on the East Coast, white family, middle class, mid-Atlantic. So the internment was, I think we spent maybe 40 seconds on it in high school at history, right? And of course, it was very neutral the way it was. Here we go, like another use of the word neutral. Was very neutral in the way they described it. I'm sure nothing in the texts mentioned anything about systemic racism or bias or discrimination or anything that would have indicated that the dominant group had made any missteps or errors in their decision to create the internment and to execute and administer the internment. And the Yasui case is the case that a lot of us don't know about. Right, we heard about the other case, the Korematsu case,
yes,
which was the kind of the case that got a lot more press. But the Yasui case was important because of his incredible personal courage.
Yeah,
at least to me. I mean, when you told me, I was like blown away. Can you talk a little bit just before we even get into it? I just think this is such a great story about the impact that we sometimes in all this work and the way the world's going right now, most of us say, well, what can one person do? And what a great example.
Right. So in 1942, Yasui was 25 years old, had graduated from the U of O Law School, was the first Japanese American member of the Oregon State Bar. He tried to find a test case, a World War I veteran, Japanese American with family, and he couldn't find anybody. So he chose to intentionally violate the curfew law, which was a federal offense, and got himself arrested, believing that the courts would vindicate his rights as a US citizen. And instead, he spent 9 months in solitary confinement at the Multnomah County Jail as his case wended its way to the US Supreme Court, where he lost. And like I said, because the court said that the curfew was based on military necessity and not on race. And whenever, especially in times of war, whenever the military is involved, the court steps back, and it really does not step into its role as a third part of government to oversee and review the actions of the military. Instead, they step back and say, well, if it's a military necessity, then we're not going to challenge that.
Yeah. Unbelievable. Great, amazing story of courage. And yeah, so I want to, so as we move into talking about it, because it's also really frustrating. It's really, I don't know how it must be enraging. I don't know what the feelings that come up for you, but for me, it's just incredibly frustrating and ironic and yeah. So one of the things I wanted to say to you, Peggy, and I said that we talked in our briefing yesterday when we talked about what we were going to talk about. I said, listen, if at any point it gets too hard, just say that. But it's true for both of us. If we're in this topic, and if my frustration and anger and harm and hurt is too much, and I can't do it reasonably, I'm just going to say let's move on. And I would invite you to feel the same, because I think one of the things, this is really back to the topic around diversity, equity, and inclusion and being practitioners, is there's a disproportionate impact on people who not only have to study this and understand it like me, but people who've had to live in it. So I just want to acknowledge that. And even though I kind of argue a lot that we should not overtax people of minoritized groups to tell their story, here I am asking you to tell your story. We're going to have the intellectual conversation about the law, but your story intersects with that conversation. So, Yeah, so I want to thank you for that, and I don't in any way take for granted the impact that this conversation can have, just psychically and spiritually, and so thank you for that.
You're
And
welcome. And let me just say, Jim, that all my relatives, my parents, all grandparents, all my relatives were incarcerated during World War II, and that their experience really has informed what I do and who I am in the world. And so fighting for justice and really fighting to build a multiracial, inclusive democracy is all part and parcel of the lessons from their experiences and other communities of color and other white allies' experiences.
right. Yeah. Well, thank you. And I guess we should be thankful to them for the legacy of their being able to talk about that experience. Yeah.
Oh, they didn't talk about that experience.
Oh, they didn't.
No, they did not talk about it. When I heard them say camp, I had no reference, block 38 or block 39. So most of what I learned on my own, because I would say they were traumatized by the war. In fact, when I spoke to my father in 1979 and asked him about the war experience, he said, I've been bitter ever since the war. It's a long time. That's 30 some years. It impacted his life.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's probably a fairly good segue into, and I thought about this, Peggy. Let's move into talking about affirmative action and the court's arguments and this race neutrality idea. But maybe a way to get into it. I mean, in the oral arguments, Justice Sotomayor talked about the fact that she was evidence of the importance and the effectiveness of affirmative action. Naming that she would probably have not, because of her grades and some of the lack of extracurricular things that she didn't have access to, she might not have gotten in had it not been for affirmative action. Now, once she was there, she did brilliantly and was very successful. But again, she offered herself up in the oral arguments as living proof that there is value to affirmative action and that it works. When we were talking, of course, I didn't connect the dots. I love this. You're from Boring, Oregon, right? Yes. The daughter of farmers, and also a beneficiary of affirmative action.
Yes, I would say that had I not had this experience, I wouldn't understand to the extent that affirmative action is very personal. And it's also a public good. But I went to Oregon State one year because my guidance counselor, I was a valedictorian in my high school class. My guidance counselor said I should live at home and go to Mount Hood Community College. That was his vision for the number one person in the class. Luckily, I had a brother at Oregon State, and I said, what am I? I'm a liberal arts major in an engineering and agricultural university. What am I doing here? So he helped me transfer. And one of the colleges was Vassar. And it was actually cheaper for me to go to Vassar than to go to Oregon State because they had diversity and affirmative action in their platform of what they wanted their student body to look like. And as I said yesterday, I think I was an N of one. Japanese American, daughter of a farmer, Boring, Oregon, grew up poor without indoor plumbing. I don't think there was any other person there, but I am a proud recipient of affirmative action. And what affirmative action, the intent was to give opportunities and erase barriers for people who had not been given opportunities and had tremendous barriers in their way to be successful.
Yeah. And, one of the things I know about you from just our personal relationship is that, there's this myth that if you are a beneficiary of affirmative action, you had it easy, and it's like, no, actually, what I've learned from you is that the pressure and responsibility to work hard and to be successful in that system. So affirmative action gets you in the room. Affirmative action doesn't keep you in the room. And so the level of effort and work to get by in a system that you're probably having to kind of be bicultural in, because there's this white, and Vassar, of course, a very traditional kind of Ivy version of what we have to do to get along, which is completely different than the context in which you grew up.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, just astonishing. And it also just blows up this myth that affirmative action means that some people get a pass.
Yes. And I think the other aspect that maybe many white people don't understand is if you come from a community of color, it's not just you that's there. It feels like you're representing the entire community, so that if you screw up, other people behind you will not get that opportunity. And it's the responsibility and the burden to do well. And the US is such a individualistic culture, especially when it comes to white folks, that people may not understand the group community culture of people of color.
Right. Yeah, and not understand it, and really, I can only understand it intellectually, viscerally. I don't have that experience. I don't have to have that experience, and I never have to represent my whole group. I mean, I do a little bit because I'll talk about white men, and people will say, "Well, you're a white man. What do white men think?" But other than that, it's very rare for somebody to single me out and ask me to speak for my group. It just doesn't happen very often. And now when it does happen, people are very, white guys get very hurt. I said, "What are you calling me a white guy?" I was like, "Well, we can talk about African Americans and Asian Americans. Can't we talk about white Americans?" Right. But it's because of our insider status. We're not named as a group. So anyway, it's a whole nother thing, as you know. But affirmative action. So, one of the things I didn't know, I kind of started before I called you, I wanted to at least be able to contain my rage around this idea of race neutrality. Mm-hmm. And so I did a little research, and I didn't know that affirmative action was not adopted as a policy to help restore and repair the terrible damage that enslaved people had had. It was not about the 14th Amendment at all, at least directly. It was indirectly about it, of course, completely. And you can talk about what I'm saying wrong about that, because I'm sure I'm missing some nuance. But it was originally set up as a policy to ensure that universities had diversity in them, because the argument was made and won that diversity in a university context matters and is helpful. I had no idea that was the basis of the case. And then this case that is being looked at is whether or not Harvard and the University of North Carolina's admissions policies favor African Americans over other minoritized groups, particularly Asian Americans. Did I get that right?
Yes, that the premise is that whites and Asian students are being discriminated against because of the affirmative action policies that focus on Blacks and Latinos and others, but it also focuses on Asians. So there's a false premise there for Asians.
So we'll say more about that. That's good.
Well, I think Mari Matsuda, who's a professor at the University of Hawaii Law School, said it best when she wrote an article entitled, "And we will not be used." We will not be used as Asian Americans in the wedge between whites and other communities of color. But that's exactly what happened in the Harvard case. So I think his name's Blum, who brought the Fisher versus University of Texas case with a white plaintiff.
Right.
And they lost, I think it was in 2016. So to get to Harvard, what he decided was that he would bring in Asian plaintiffs so that he could curtail this idea that it's whites against people of color. And I think there's always been a segment of the Asian American population that believes that they've been harmed by affirmative action, that really don't understand the historical significance and or the significance of Asian Americans being allies in allyship with African Americans and Latinos and other Native Americans and other people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have just assumed that they were harmed by affirmative action. And this is not the majority of Asian Americans believe and support affirmative action. That's the first thing I want to say. So there's a minority of Asian Americans that I feel are being used in this war to withhold or to continue to keep in place Jim Crow and the segregation from hundreds of years ago. And so, sadly, I think they got sucked into this, and there's a belief that they were harmed. And I just read this article that actually there is a bias for Asian Americans, but the bias is that we're smarter than we think we are, or that we're given a halo effect on how smart we are academically. So within the Asian community, there's differences.
Yeah, it feels like the way you're describing it, it's almost like let's not. Yeah, I mean, having the Asian student group be kind of the co-litigants is like a way for the white people to get a pass to say, oh, it's not about us. We don't have any bias, but they're upset. And I just think about how often does that happen, where the false equivocation happens, where it's like, well, that's not just true for Black people, that's also true for Indigenous people, or it's just true for Asian people. It's like, instead of just, it all feels like code to me. And that's what was so surprising to me, is like at the Supreme Court, we have a justice that says he doesn't understand the definition of diversity.
Right.
It's like, what are we doing? And the race neutrality thing is like, why is that question even allowed? Because Justice Thomas knows what we're talking about. I'm sorry, he does. And actually, he answered his own question by saying, well, I guess it means everybody gets everything. So that wasn't really an answer to me. It was like, oh my gosh, they're going to overturn this law. If enough of those people feel the way Thomas does, they're going to overturn this. Because it's based on a false premise. And I don't understand why the lawyers can't say, time out, we're having the wrong discussion here. I mean, I do know why, but it's almost like they've set up the conditions such that they'll be able to overturn affirmative action based on a number of false premises. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Well, I think what you're saying to me is that they started using the term race neutral or race neutrality. And then the lawyers for Harvard and for University of North Carolina started arguing within that paradigm rather than busting the paradigm and saying that historically things, the executive order in World War II, Executive Order 9066, promulgated by President Roosevelt, was race neutral. Oh. But everybody knew. So it didn't say Japanese Americans. What it said was the military has the right to determine who can stay and who has to leave these military zones. But everybody knew the impact and how it was going to be used was against Japanese Americans. So this race neutral term is one, I think, that is a term of art signaling to other people that really the impact is not going to be race neutral, as we know from California, from the UC system, where they were banned from affirmative action, and they've tried any number of ways to create inclusion in their educational systems, and they said that nothing has worked. So whatever the Supreme Court says are, quote, race neutral policies, they're designed to not work because they haven't worked.
Right. Yeah, I don't even, if we really want to, you said this yesterday, it's like, you really want to be race neutral? Okay, let's talk about what race neutral really means. And the thing that drives me nuts about the race neutral or the race neutrality argument, you're saying it, but I'll just, the way I think about it is, it's not been race neutral for 500 years or 400 years, however long Harvard's been around. It's not been race neutral. As a matter of fact, it was race exclusive.
Yes.
And it was originally, it was overtly racially exclusive. It was like, well, of course, you not only have to be white, but you have to be landholding, you have to be rich
And male.
and male, right, and white. So there's, and probably, and presumably heterosexual, all these other things that kind of lump in on top of that. So it's like, so for 400 years, well, up until when we established, affirmative action, for 400 years, that was the standard. So now we're going to go to race neutral.
Yes.
What you had a remedy for this? What was your remedy? It was great. It was like, okay, I got a remedy. Do you remember?
Well,
yeah.
Well, when I looked into race neutrality, I pulled up these articles about presidents of universities, and there's no race neutrality to select presidents of universities. There is a strong bias towards white men. So if we want race neutrality at the front end of an institution, why don't we have it at the very top of the institution?
Right.
And that will not happen. So there is a myth. It is a myth that white people especially want to hold on to, and people like Clarence Thomas, that but for affirmative action, there would be a level playing field. There will be a meritocracy. But that's exactly why, well, first of all, affirmative action started for white people long before the Civil Rights Acts and et cetera. But the myth that we could actually bring in people and have them participate in equal status with the dominant group has not played out. It's not come to fruition.
Right. Yeah. So again, and then there's in the argument they talked about the ALDC students, the people who are allowed into the universities. 30% of the class is made up of people who are athletes or legacy family members, and other people who are on special lists that receive special treatment. So we're arguing about affirmative action, but we're not doing anything about what literally, is the privilege list. Mm-hmm. The ALDC list is like those people that get an exception to the norm.
Right. They make up 5% of applicants and 30% of entrants and classes at Harvard. So for 85% of Harvard's 400 years, they have been discriminatory and prohibited people of color, and also white women to a certain extent from being included. And now they want to say, after 15% of the time, you can no longer do this. Right. And I think what would be a fair remedy is for the next 85% to make up for what they did. They actually have to over enroll these folks because
for the next 400 years.
Did. Yeah.
For the next 400 years. And then we'll see where we are.
Right. 85% of the next 400 years.
Right. Okay. Right. Let's be specific. But of course, the remedy's, ludicrous. But it's not. It's not ludicrous. It's just it's untenable to do that. But it talks about the disproportionate way the entire system's weighted. Yeah. And what they're acknowledging and what they're pretending to not acknowledge, and yes. That what's behind all of that. And the thing that really surprised me about the oral arguments, particularly from the justices who I would argue were against, and they talked about diversity and inclusion. They talked about where they thought it was important and where they didn't. And the justices, all of whom I identify as conservative, that were against or arguing, it seemed to be arguing, trying to disprove the efficacy of affirmative action. Their arguments were all based on this premise, and nobody kind of challenged the question. And I felt like at some point I wish they just stopped and said, "Listen, what this is really about is we got to figure out a way to change admissions policies without making white people uncomfortable." Right? But it's all code. They don't really talk about that.
Right. Know? Well, and uncomfortable means white-centeredness. To have at the center this idea that the norm is white. And if we get out of balance, then white people get fearful. So, there was a time when at Berkeley, what they wanted to do was to reverse the LSAT, the emphasis on the LSAT from math to language arts, because, quote, too many Asians were getting into Berkeley. And so they were going to flip the equation. And several of us got together and we said, if you do that, we're going to sue. And so they didn't do that. But that idea of who has the right to be at the top, what are the percentages and proportions that make us feel comfortable and in charge, those have been all throughout our history. And I think in a large extent that this is historical. It is not just 2022. It comes through the entire history of Congress, the Southern Democrats who really had a disproportionate influence on the New Deal and the Fair Deal, because if they wanted to maintain their Jim Crow culture. And if they didn't maintain that, they withheld their approval from the rest of the Democrats. So in order to bring everybody around, there were legislation that was passed that was neutral on its face, race neutrality, that really had a disproportionate impact on certain people. So in some of that, the New Deal, they excluded farm workers and maids from the labor force that created modern unions and laws that set minimum wages and regulated hours of work. They were 60% and 75% African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
But Congress excluded them because the South wanted them excluded, and therefore they were. But all that legislation didn't say we're going to exclude Blacks. It was, quote, race neutral. And right. I think that's what they're asking in Harvard and in UNC and frankly, all the higher education. No, we're not going to say it has a disproportionate impact on students of color, but it does, and it will. And the UC system shows that.
Oh, yeah. And, it's in the context of the midterm elections that we just had and everything else that's happening, to me, it still feels like we are in this bizarre phase of American history, making the transition away from having a white majority, right? So we're in the last stages of minority rule to some degree. And, so I have to start, and people that look like me have to start thinking about what's it feel like to be part of the minority. And of course, we've whitewashed that by saying, I'm not part of the minority. I'm going to be part of the new minority majority. Right. Right. Is that the right term? Is that, majority minority.
Majority minority refers to minority communities who will be numerically in the majority. Right. But instead of being able to call them the majority, they use the term majority minority to continue that political one up, one down.
Put them in the box. Put them in the one down box.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And a communications person said, well, then what do we call them? I said, how about the majority?
The majority, right?
Yes.
Right. And again, so the thing that's just so powerful about it is all of this is unconsciously or consciously about white centering. It's about keeping that group. That's the group that somehow the lobby that needs to be mollified or needs to be reassured in the process of what they're doing with affirmative action and everything else. It's like, oh my gosh. And, you and I talk about this a lot in terms of our work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. Is like, you gotta talk to the white guys, but how do you talk to the white guys without centering white culture? It's like we continue to center white culture. White culture is a big part of what happens even in business culture, but let's find a way to stop centering it, because we know everybody knows that story. Well, everybody knows that story who has to fit into that culture, right? Some
Yes.
of us don't know that story as well. And that's part of the problem is for us to be part of the solution, meaning white people, we have to actually understand what's happening. But because it's all been so carefully laid out for us on a nice feather bed of emotional security, we don't actually get to understand what the majority minority really means and why people are saying that.
Yes. Yeah. And largely because we're not, none of us are schooled in really the history and what's happened to get us to today. And even if we are schooled in that, we don't emotionally want to believe it, or especially white people don't emotionally want to believe that it was a very constructed argument and premise and philosophy and political channel to continue on with really segregation, enslavement, Jim Crow, all those things. If you look at the voter suppression laws of today, they are not dissimilar to what happened in the early 30s, and 40s about the way that people wanted to keep the South segregated.
Right.
Especially Southern politicians wanted to keep the South segregated. I mean,
the Southern strategy. Yeah.
Yes. And so we're fighting. That's why I believe we're fighting for the democracy, the true democracy of this country and the country's promise of democracy that has been unfulfilled up until now.
Yeah. Well, Peggy, I don't know what's going to happen. I was very despondent after listening to the oral arguments, just the passive aggressive or even just the aggressive, nature of some of the questions that were obviously not really questions, but chances to make statements. Our audience for this is our clients, but also other DEI practitioners. So I think the thing over the short term, I'm afraid they're going to overturn it. I hope I would so love to be wrong. I'm afraid they're going to overturn it, regardless of what happens with that ruling. As a DEI practitioner who also has a bigger context around what's happening with affirmative action, what do you think we ought to be aware of? What words of advice or support, not support, but advice, just what do you think? How are you going to approach what's happening in your practice?
Well, I think it's very important for us to understand the history and the history of affirmative action. Right. And most of us don't. Most of us have not been taught that history. So I would recommend a book called When Affirmative Action Was White, and other books that help explain the history so that people can get deeply embedded in just the facts and the numbers. The second thing is we rarely talk about affirmative action in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And why is that? Why has that not been brought up? When I started in this field in the late 70s, early 80s, we did talk about affirmative action. And people, I think, understood it more. I think that DEI practitioners need to bring it back. Like, what is really going on?
Right. Let's have the conversation. Let's have the conversation under the conversation.
Yes. Yeah. About race
Let's
neutrality.
have the real conversation.
Yes.
Right.
Let's talk about what race neutrality means and for whom and what the impact is. And how is affirmative action? I think DEI practitioners need to understand the loss that comes from not having affirmative action. I remember talking to a graduate class in the business school at the University of Oregon, and I looked around the room and everybody was white. And the first words out of my mouth is, you ought to sue the University of Oregon because you are getting an inferior education. Your inferior education has to do with, if you look around this room, there are all white students here. You will not be equipped to go out into the world, into a racially diverse world, and be successful. You are getting an inferior education. I think you ought to sue.
I bet that was a real uncomfortable moment. Lots of looking at their fingernails and saying, all right, yeah. Jeez. Yeah. Well, good. And back to the final thing for me about the affirmative action, separate from the conversation around diversity, is just okay. If we really want to do affirmative action, if we really want to be race neutral, that means really there's no way we would never really do race neutrality. It's just the system's actually not even concocted to allow that to happen.
Yes.
Right.
What they're really saying is we don't want to be race neutral when it comes to whites. We want to be race neutral when it comes to people of color. And they can't even fathom what it means to be race neutral when it comes to white people. I mean, just take any leadership segmentation and say, we are no longer going to prefer white people and white men, especially. What would we have to do to have that happen?
Right.
What would we have to do with these resumes or anything else in our process?
Yeah, Judge Kagan in the Justice Kagan in the oral argument said, "What's wrong with diversity, equity, and inclusion? It's good enough for the U.S. Army. It's good enough for the corporations in the country. But why can't we figure out how to embrace it in the work that we're doing? The armed forces embrace it. Corporate America embraces it. So why are we out of sync here?"
Yeah. And McKinsey and Deloitte have already made the business case for diversity and inclusion. They said that if you have white women on your senior leadership team, your return on investment is going to be X percentage higher. But if you have people of color on that senior leadership team, your return on investment is like 35% higher. They've already proven the business case for diversity.
There is no challenging the thesis. I mean, anybody, it's a little bit like global warming or climate change. It's like the data is in on this. There are outliers who still want to challenge it, but a vast majority of the community, the intellectual communities in both cases, have weighed in on this. There's no question about the validity of it. So to me, it's not even about the validity of it. It's an emotional issue. And we're not naming it as not emotional. It's an emotional issue because of the fear about decentering white people and what that might mean. But we can't have that conversation.
Well, yes, it's a quote emotional issue because of white supremacy. Because people who are white have been used to having everything. And it reminds me of the survey that said that if men aren't given 65% of the airtime, they feel like they're being excluded. And women, even if they're given 50% of the airtime, they don't use it all up. So there is an assumption like fish and water. This is my culture. I'm comfortable here and I don't want you to change it. But it's so transparent and it's been over so many generations and it's so unconscious in some ways that to bring it to consciousness means really upsetting people, and people need to be upset. That's what John Lewis called good trouble. It's like DEI practitioners need to get into good trouble. And my fear is that that DEI practitioners want a contract or they want the work. And so are they really living up to what we ought to be talking about?
Right. Yeah, we need to be talking about race neutrality when we're. I mean, I think I have a stance on unconscious bias. But if you just teach unconscious bias, I think we're eating one bite out of the pie instead of looking at the whole thing. And to me, it's like if we're going to talk about unconscious bias, let's talk about race neutrality. Let's talk about an actual application of unconscious bias in government and in systems.
Well, and let's talk about the reason why that bias is unconscious. Because for others of us, it is not unconscious bias that we experience and see. It's only when it comes, it's only when it comes to white people that we use the term unconscious bias.
Right.
So deconstructing that argument in and of itself would be an interesting exercise for DEI practitioners. Yeah. The other thing is the term microaggressions, which is fine in some ways, but aggression is aggression. Macro, it's like, do we minimize certain things that we talk about in DEI by the terms that we use.
Right. Yeah, well, microaggressions, it's like, why does it have to be? Is it really micro? I mean, do you feel like the aggressions you've experienced in your life are little tiny things? Like,
No.
and we use paper cuts a lot to describe them. Sometimes they're axe wounds, for God's sakes. So, but we make it all, we make it dainty, we make it small, we make it, comfortable and palatable. Yeah. I was going to say, one of the things I think that we can do as practitioners is continue to be the work that we're trying to understand. Like yesterday, you were very gracious about it, but we were talking about it, and I was saying, I'll give you an outline because I don't want you to feel like you have to over prepare. And I went on and on about, you're really good at being really prepared for stuff. And I don't want you to feel like you have to work too. I was trying to, in my own good white guy thing, trying to help make it a little easier for you. And you said, Jim, I've had to be prepared my whole life.
Yeah.
I don't know what you mean by it doesn't even make sense to me about being over prepared. I know I've got to be ready. Right. And of course, I'm coming from my own white male privilege around, I don't want you to have to worry about and it's back to what you talked about before. Are you going to be judged based on your group membership for how you show up in a conversation, even like this? Of course. Am I going to be judged in the same ways? Usually not. Right. So it's just, so to me, one of the things as practitioners is when we find ourselves living out that which we're trying to undo, we just need to own it. I'm embarrassed by that. I don't like it, but it's obvious to everybody else that it's happening.
Yeah. And I think, working with white male co-facilitators, that if they have not done their own work, their own internal work, their own internalized oppression or their privilege work, and they have this kind of persona of being a good guy, I'm one of the good ones, I understand. But if they haven't done that deep work about the racism and how they have been privileged from that race by that racism, they really can't co-facilitate. They really won't have my back, especially when the times come in which I need them to step forward.
Right.
And I think that I've worked with some really, really good white male co-facilitators, including you, Jim. But I've also worked with white male co-facilitators that, that really don't understand. They have blinders just like the other white people in the room that we're facilitating. It's not a script. This is not a script. This is not something to do for money. For some of us, this is our lives. This is our life.
Right. Yeah. Ooh. Yeah, it is your life. And it's about what you're doing or needing to do to fight for your own survival in some ways, and the survival of people around the world who are outsiders, who don't necessarily get the same advantage because of their membership in groups. I appreciate you saying that about me, but I'm constantly, and you're so good about not holding it against me. It's like, I don't know how many times I've stepped in it around my own unconscious bias, around my own conditioning, my own racial conditioning, my own gender conditioning, my own sexual orientation conditioning. It's just all that stuff. I step in it all the time. And you're such a good reflection for me because there are times where you've called me out, and that hurts, but you're calling me out because it's hurt you, and I've got to be willing to sit in whatever discomfort you have and whatever discomfort I have without needing to justify it or defend it or redirect it or explain it. And that's overcoming a lot of conditioning that I have around that, so Peggy, I want to talk for a minute as we kind of start wrapping up. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about empathy. And one of the values, regardless of what happens with affirmative action, is this. I think you and I agree that we've got to keep the focus on what empathy looks and feels like for leaders and how they can exemplify that in this work on diversity and inclusion. And one of the places to start was you came up with some interesting research that you've been looking at about school children and why diversity is important. Can you share some of that?
Yes. So recent studies on children and the impact of learning the full history of the United States. And what these studies showed was when children learn the full history of the United States, then they have more empathy for African Americans, for Latinos, and for other people of color. They have more of a sense of their own ability to help right some wrongs and to make the playing field more equitable. So that's one of the big teachings, and they will move in the course and towards justice and equity. And I saw this article on white allyship. And one of the key 4 components of white allyship is empathy. Stepping into the shoes of another, stepping into the thought process of another and saying, if this happened to me, what would I be thinking? If this happened to me, what would I be feeling? And then the third article is that empathy is a key component of effective leadership. So I know that by teaching the true history of this country, we would actually come up, and the net would be better leadership for the country, which to me says more productivity, more whatever for business, which is part of I think that's important.
Yeah. Yeah.
Empathy is key.
Yeah. And that's another argument for, as you said, I'm just restating to amplify, it's another argument for why we need to keep talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's at not only at the corporate level, but with our children. And the way to talk about it is by talking about the real history. It's like why I wrote the book I wrote about, gaslights and dog whistles. Like, if we can't talk about what happened, we can't learn from it. And if we try to erase it from the historical record, that's not going to be good for any of us. I want to say, Becky, we'll do a biography at the end with a bunch of resources, including when affirmative action was white in my book and some of the articles you're talking about. Let's put them all in there and make sure that they go out to everybody so they can get them. So final, I got some questions for you, but anything else you want to say about that we didn't cover around this affirmative action and DEI and what's it mean to all of us?
Well, I would just say that there's no such thing as race neutrality, that what they will do is have race neutral language that has a disproportionate negative impact on students of color. And I think what white people don't understand, and it will affect their education as well. They don't see the loss for themselves in this. They only see it as a gain, but that is not true. They will lose a lot by not having colleagues of color learning right beside them.
Right. Yeah, you've said that so many times, and one of the ways you've really mentored me is when I say, "Well, we got to do this because it's good for minoritized groups," and to go, "Wait a minute, Jim, some of us will take care of ourselves. What are you doing for you? What does this have to do with you?" And that's the harder question. It's not that hard, but you had to. I don't know how many times you had to say that to me before I started really internalizing it and going, "What is this about?" And I think that's part of my work for sure, is trying to help people who are part of insider groups to understand what the enlightened self-interest for them is. And part of it is not that, we have privilege, so let's use it honorably. It's like, that's a redirect. It's like, I've got privilege, so I'll use it honorably to help everybody else, which then is just playing into the white supremacist mindset that, since I have it, I'm going to be honorable. I'm going to get on the white horse now and give what I've got to everybody else. Ooh, eesh. Yeah. Well, so what's the alternative to using it honorably? What is that?
Well, it's understanding that in order for things to be equitable, that you're going to have to compete in an equitable manner. You have not competed, not you, Jim, but people have not competed across the board in an equitable fashion.
Right.
And that means that you're not always going to win. You're not always going to be on top, unless we institute apartheid.
Right. Oh, yeah, great. Right. And
Well,
so, but what you're saying, Peggy, is really, really, I think, incredibly powerful, which is the truth is it's another version of code around this honorables thing. It's code for you're going to have to give up some privilege.
yes.
Right. And we don't want to say that. It's like, welcome to diversity. There's something in it for all of us. Everybody's going to feel good.
Exactly.
Whoa, 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 whoa.
Yes, that's bullshit.
Yeah.
And we have to start calling it that.
Right.
Because how do you have equity and privilege at the same time? I mean, if we want to, huh?
Yeah.
If
I'm
we
going to
want
write
to,
that down. There's a
yes,
question. Yeah.
if we want to compete, I'll go head to head with anybody. And I'll probably win because I know how to work harder than most people. But when there's not an equitable system, between the two of us, Jim, who are they going to see as the leader?
Me.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we saw that when we worked together.
Yeah.
We'd go into your clients and they'd start talking to me and I'm like, she's the, yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. So that's a really good point is, to something for all of us to think about is how do we dress up the reality that, for equity to really take root and work. I know you have some challenges, like you think equity is a dream, because what it would mean is we would have to really be willing to mete out resources appropriately. Yeah. And there's been no evidence in human history that we're willing to do that. Mm-hmm. Not just in the United States, but almost anywhere. So, yeah. So how do we actually let go of some of our privilege and realize that for the world to be a better place, we're going to have less privilege?
Well, and maybe you would be in a better place if you let go of some of your privilege. And maybe if white people could see their own liberation by giving up that privilege and how much it costs them to want to hold and selfishly hold that privilege. They need to understand the value for themselves about what or the damage that privilege has meant upon them and the society and these white male shooters that mow down all these people. I mean, I really think that it comes down to things like that.
Yeah. Well, and the energetic cost that it takes for us to maintain the status quo. It's like the liberation. When the first time I heard liberation, I was like, where's the liberation for me in this? The liberation for me is in being part of a group that no longer has to kind of pretend that there's this reality of safety that we're all surrounded by because we're all upholding a false system. Yeah. A false system that's based on, race neutrality. So gosh, whatever happens with the Supreme Court, I'm hopeful that in the arc of human history will bend towards justice. Whatever happens in the short term.
And all I would say to the Supreme Court is we will not go back. Roe versus Wade, overturn it, but we will not go back.
Yep. And we just saw that in the election. We just saw it. Yep.
Yes.
So Peggy, kind of just so to finish out and to kind of give the audience a chance to kind of understand a little bit more about you and you can humanize the conversation a little bit more. We've been very human in the conversation, but what are you reading? What are you reading? What's at your bedside table right now?
Well, I read a combination of fiction that's just sort of trash, that is about the mystery novels or things like that. So I can stop my mind from working overtime. Right. And then, as I said, I'm reading when affirmative action was white. And your book, say the title again.
Gaslights and Dog Whistles.
Gaslights and Dog Whistles. Everybody should read that book. DEI
nice.
practitioners.
Oh, you're nice. I'm reading. Thank you for that. Thank you for the plug. And I agree. But it's not a book to read if you want to let go of all your angst. Right, you better go read The Hobbit. Well, even The
Yeah.
Hobbit. Yeah, right. But I'm reading Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation.
Wow.
And it's not, I want to just say for anybody who's listening about that's a white evangelical, we know that it's not like every group, it's not a monolith, but there is a faction, according to the author, there's a faction of white evangelicals who have, there's a monetary story behind that,
Mhm.
and there's a power and control story behind that. I wanted
Mhm.
to understand it better because I do over stereotype that group, and that's not fair to white evangelicals that are colleagues and partners and friends. Um, so I'm reading that, and like you, I'm reading a bunch of trashy other stuff. Yeah. What do
To
you
get our
do?
minds.
Yeah. What do you do that is restorative? What do you do to take care of yourself?
I walk, I do yoga, I get massages. I have a lot of practitioners that I go to, yoga, massage, acupuncture. And then I think I'm by myself a lot,
And is
which
that
is
restorative?
which is restorative. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a great backyard that I sit in. Uh, and I think and this might sound strange, but I think I talked to my little Peggy, that kid inside each of
Mm,
us that oftentimes we have put in a closet and slammed the door and barricaded it, that wants to come out and needs to be tended to, with
mm,
care and loving.
mm. Wow. Yeah. Thank you for that. And I have a constant battle with little Jimmy, you know, little afraid Jimmy.
Hmm.
I don't listen to him very well sometimes. I pretend he's not there.
Yeah.
I do the same thing it's the same kind of narrative warping that I do otherwise, and we're talking about. Um, and then the final thing is, what gives you hope for the future?
Hmm. Because Derek Bell once said to me that you have to do what's right, regardless of the personal cost.
Mm,
And the second thing he said is that in the end, we will not be judged by the results we attain, but by the quality of the struggle we maintain. So there's no Hollywood ending. This is really about the honesty and the virtue and really the life affirming way that resistance can have in one's life, that it can affirm my life and why I'm here, and I believe I'm here for justice, and what results we have uh, will be, whatever the results will be, but I will not give up. I
mm,
will not give up my voice. I will keep marching forward, as I have the responsibility to do, given Minoru Yasui and what he did, given Derek Bell and what he did, and the many other men and women who came before us.
yeah. Wow. Well, thank you for that. Thanks. And I'm not going to offer any of mine up because I want yours to ring about what you have hope for. So thank you. And Peggy, thank you for the time and for um, sharing your story and your heart and your knowledge about this topic. And we could go on and on. I mean, we just skimmed across the surface of some of this. Is it okay for folks to reach out to you if they have questions or want more information?
Maybe.
Maybe. Well, yeah, we'll direct everybody to me and we'll kind of figure it out that way.
That
Okay.
would be
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. Good. 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 Well, again, thank you so much for the time, and really, really a gift to me, and I hope a gift to our audience. That was, invaluable. Yeah. So thank you.
Well, and Jim, thank you for the work that you're doing. This kind of work, the writing of the book, your posts, your other writings, your blogs, and this work really is important, and especially as a white male, to be doing this kind of work. I really, really appreciate it. And what I would say is that a lot of white men, it's they may have good intent, but their impact could go sideways. And what they need to do is to align their intent and their impact.
Mhm.
And that's an ongoing process for all of us. And I've seen you work hard at it.
Yeah.
Seen
Yeah.
you work hard at it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Peggy. Thanks so much.